Welcome to Gospel Lessons. I'm Kevin Prince. We are continuing our discussion with Bruce Porter about false Christmas traditions, and I guarantee you haven't heard the last one Bruce talks about. For those that don't know Bruce, he is a renowned scholar with degrees in ancient Near Eastern and Middle East studies, specializing in Semitic languages and religious history. Bruce has authored over 16 books and is well known for his research on the Pearl of Great Price. I first met him on a life-changing tour in 2018, which inspired this Gospel Lessons YouTube channel. If you've never traveled with Bruce, I highly recommend it. He frequently speaks and guides on LDS-based cruises with Go and Do Travel. These cruises offer opportunities to connect with like-minded members and learn from speakers like Bruce. I'll be joining the Momentum 2026 cruise with him, and if you're interested, use promo code PRINCE for $100 off. All proceeds from Gospel Lessons, including sponsorships, all go to charity. Have an idea for a future episode? Send it to me at gospellessons1@gmail.com. Now, back where we left off, talking about Herod and the year of Christ's birth. But speaking of Herod, our entire calendaring system is based on this event of Christ's birth. We're in 2024, almost 2025 now, meaning 2025 years since the birth of Christ. And yet, that doesn't jive with some of the things that we know about the birth of Christ, the time. For example, they talk about Herod, we know he caused the slaughter of the innocents from the New Testament, but at the same time, the record shows that he died in, either 2 or 4 BC. So how do we reconcile that from a tradition standpoint?
All we know for sure, or that we can at least count on, and a lot of people don't count on it anyway, is the statement in the Doctrine and Covenants, section 20, where Christ says that his birth was, 1830 years ago. And that's where we get that. And that would been in April. Now, so far as the exact date, they can't even come to a date for Adam being cast out of the Garden of Eden. They put it at 4004. You might think it would be at 4000 if it's going to be anything. That's where it really has to begin, but they put it at 4004. And so, and the same with Christ. And so those dates can move around. I think all we know for sure is that we could probably count on April 6th as the birth of Christ. Now, was Herod alive? Was he dead? We know that at least 2 years after Christ's birth, we have the slaughter of the innocents taking place. So we could even push that birth of Christ back to accommodate for that. We don't understand. There's always a discrepancy in chronology unless you can use some type of astronomical or some type of event that can be timed, and then you got to start making connections. So,
but even then, those can be interesting because there are records of supernovas that are made by those in India and those in China, 2 years, 2 BC, according to our calendar. But even their own records kind of contradict themselves.
Yeah,
so
exactly.
you can't nail it down more than that. We just kind of have to know that Christ was born and these events happened, but as to exact dates, it seems like that's more difficult.
It is. And so, you don't need to focus on it. You need to focus on the realities, and the realities as he was born. So, and the connection between April, there's many connections. You have the taxing that takes place. That always takes place in the spring of the year after the winter rains. The taxing takes place. The censuses takes place as part of the taxing process. April 6th, you have Moses taking the children of Israel out on Passover, 40 years to the day they crossed the Jordan River into the Promised Land, which would be April or Passover again. You have Christ being born on Passover. You have the resurrection, the rebirth, Christ's death and resurrection taking place on Passover at the same time. You have the church being organized at the same time on the same date. You have the dedication of the Kirtland Temple at the same time and the same date. Even the first vision was early in the spring of the year. And March 27th or 29th, I think, is the date that they've tried to narrow it down to so far as the time of the first vision. So all of these events, there's a pattern that begins to be set up in that sometime around that April 6th or Passover time.
Interesting. So yeah, that's another tradition, is that Christ's birth was December 25th, and in fact, it was probably April 6th or around the Passover time. So another tradition that we're discussing here. Any other traditions around the Christmas and the season that you'd want to share?
Well, I think there's one other one that I think is important, and that is the no room at the inn. The scriptures tell us in the New Testament that after they arrived in Bethlehem, it says after they're there, it says the time came for her to be delivered. It doesn't mean that they rode into town while she was, or came into Bethlehem and she was having labor pains when they got there. It basically says within the text that the time came while they were there in Bethlehem, the time came for her to be delivered. And so they look for a room or for a place for them to stay. Now, you have to keep in mind there's some Jewish rules and laws under the law of Moses that make it very difficult for a woman to give birth within a home or a house that doesn't actually belong to them. Now, when they go to I had my daughter, my second child was born in Israel. And when we left the birthing center, it was a birthing hospital. It wasn't a regular hospital. It was a birthing hospital called Misgavalada. When my wife and I walked out of there with our child, the waiting room was filled with Orthodox Jews. When she came out of the door where she was staying, when she came out of the door and we walked through that waiting room, those Orthodox Jews scattered like quail. Because if she were to touch them, even a robe or any part of her clothing were to touch them, they would be unclean. And you have to sometimes think about that. When Mary is about to give birth and they go to a place and he says there's no room in the inn, I think is what he's saying. There is no room for the privacy for the birth that you're going to give, because when that takes place, when a woman becomes unclean, and she's unclean when she gives birth under the Jewish law, she's given an 8 or a 8x8 square or an 8x5 foot area rug, and that's where she has to stay. And she has to give birth there. She has to eat there. She has to relieve herself there. She has to stay on that, especially if there's other people there. And I think is what the innkeeper was saying, is we don't have room here for the delivery that you need and the privacy you need to take in order to give birth. We don't have that privacy. We don't have enough room for you to maintain that area until you go to the temple and become clean. And I think that the stable that they stayed in probably belonged to the innkeeper, and it was a place where he knew that they could have the privacy that they needed and would require to give birth, because no room in the inn is no room in the inn for a woman that's going to give birth, and everyone would have to stay away or keep away, or she would be sequestered to a certain area within that building itself, and the buildings were very small anyway.
So what about the tradition that no room in the inn, kind of like it was just so full from the taxation of the people that were going to their cities, but then there's now also the belief by many that people were doing the math and realizing that Mary was pregnant not by Joseph, or not when they were married, and therefore they didn't want her around. They didn't want them associated with it. My understanding is there was likely family of Mary or Joseph in Bethlehem, and there's the upper rooms or the areas where you could house guests but they wouldn't have been allowed or permitted, or they weren't welcome in those because of her situation or the belief around her getting pregnant.
And that very well could be. The scriptures are silent on that. The pregnancy out of wedlock was really brought up is the discussion that takes place between Mary and Gabriel, and then later on at the time of Christ, after Christ begins his ministry, it's brought up. However, there's in the genealogy of Christ that we see in Matthew, the genealogy of Christ includes a number of women, but each one of those women that are mentioned in the genealogy of Christ have done something to set the tongues a wagging at the in Relief Society. And that was, you have Rahab the harlot, you have Tamar who slept with Judah, you have Bathsheba and David, you have Ruth and Boaz, and you have Mary. See, each one of these are somehow connected to some type of pregnancy that's going to be, and each of them in the line of Christ. And then so you have all of these women that seem to have done something that we would think would be morally wrong, but actually leads to Mary and the birth of Christ. So the line comes through all of those women that, from Rahab, who's at Jericho, and she's the harlot that saves the spies that come into Jericho, all the way down to Mary being pregnant without being married. And the same thing happens because there's no marriage between any of them. Rahab was married. Rahab was. But when you look at Tamar wasn't married to Judah, but Judah owed her a son. And so she ends up sleeping with Judah. We see the same thing with Bathsheba. Bathsheba was not married to David. But the son they have, Solomon, is after that marriage. The first child dies. And then you have Ruth, and when it says uncovered his feet, if you remember, Naomi has Ruth take a bath and put perfumes on, put all the colors on, and Boaz is probably half soused after after celebrating the harvest and things like that. But when it says to uncover his feet, that means to lie with him that night. That's what it means. And so what we call the nativity in Luke, that we always read, Luke chapter 2, we always read that as the nativity. The nativity, that story, or the nativity story, is not the story of Christ. It's the story of Mary to prove that he is the Christ. Even Isaiah says, what are the signs of the coming of the Messiah? A virgin shall conceive. In the Book of Mormon twice, it talks about the virgin who's pure above all that's pure, and it says, and her name shall be called Mary. So they're showing that the matrilineal, the matriarch, is really the one, that the signs of the Messiah is the mother. Every king of Judah at their coronation in the Old Testament, every king of Judah's mother is mentioned at their coronation, every single one of them. And so what we have in the nativity, in Luke's nativity there, is the story of Mary to prove that her child is the Messiah. It's not the story of Christ. It's the story of Mary, that she's fulfilling these prophecies.
That's fantastic. Well, thanks, Bruce. Any final words on a Christmas message to everybody around dispelling false traditions?
Well, you could go on forever and ever on that, but false traditions, it doesn't matter whether we have false traditions or sing songs. I was thinking, we sang the other day in our sacrament meeting, Joy to the World. And Joy to the World is a song of the second coming. It's not the song of the first coming, but it's a song all about the second coming. That's what Joy to the World is all about. It's not the first coming.
Another false tradition I didn't even knew existed. Thank you very much. It's a joy always to have you, Bruce. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks for joining us today and learning about false traditions. Remember to like, subscribe, and share.
It's the gift that keeps on giving the whole year.
Thanks for watching.